Welcome.
Okay, we started the recording.
Excellent. So Thal, can I start? Greetings,
Yes,
then you
yes,
can join me.
Yes, Mr. Dahri, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and good evening in some countries. This is Noor Dari, founder and executive director, Islamic Theology of Counterterrorism, a think tank based in the UK. It's a great pleasure for ITCT and the Institute for Cyber Policy Studies, Israel, to jointly organize the first ever virtual event on the topic of the Taliban and the digital life. Let me explain a little thing. Because of the current pandemic situation across the globe, we have rescheduled the event from 19th December last year. And one of our panelists from Afghanistan, former Afghan ambassador, was not able to make it due to the infected with COVID, and we wish him a speedy recovery. The rest of the event will be moderated by the Dr. Tal Powell, founder and director of Cyber from Israel. Dr. Tal, can you introduce yourself, my friend?
Yes, of course. As presented by Mr. Dahri, I'm the founder and director of the Israeli Institute for Cyber Policy Studies, and together with Mr. Dahri, we organized this event. Would you like to have some of you more words, Mr. Dahri?
No, that's fine. Thank you very much. We have a very honor to host two distinguished members of the panels, Dr. Kirti Singh from India and Ahmed Qureshi from Pakistan. Let me introduce one by one. Start from the Dr. Kirti Singh, right? Dr. Kirti Singh is a qualitative researcher, communication expert, and author. She is presently an assistant professor at the School of Film, Media, and Entertainment at Sharjah University, and also non-resident senior research fellow at the Institute of Cyber Policy Studies, Israel. She is doctorate in mass communication and journalism. She has written and presented numerous reports, both at international and national level. She is also a recipient of the Best Research for the year 2021 award from a leading education think tank based in New Delhi, India. She also a member of the prestigious institutes like International Institute for Qualitative Methodology, University of Alberta, Canada, Commonwealth General Association, International Academic Forum, Japan, and Qualitative Research Association of Malaysia. Welcome, Dr. Kirti Singh.
Thank you so much, sir.
A second participant, Ahmed Qureshi from Pakistan. Ahmed Qureshi is a journalist, author, and the television personality. With 2 decades of the experience in the Pakistan Gulf MENA region, he worked as a war correspondent in Lebanon, Syria, Kuwait, Iraq, and Afghanistan for international media organizations, and delivered lectures on the Yemen and Iraq conflicts at international forums, including the United Nations. He has interacted on the ground with the principals in the international coalition on Iraq between 1994 and 2003. As a war correspondent, he has written on the presence of foreign militant in training camps in Bekaa Valley, Lebanon, covered Iraq conflict from 1991 to 2003, meeting and interviewing a principal in the conflict, including as an embedded journalist with the US military in 2003 invasion of Iraq. He covered Afghanistan for Al Jazeera post 9/11, and Israel, Hezbollah for 2006. Ladies and gentlemen, today's event will last an hour, and each speaker has 15 to 20 minutes to share their views, and we will have 10 minutes question answer from audience before successfully ending the event. We will take a few questions only due to the limitation of the time. Dr. Tal, off you.
Thank you, Mr. Dahri. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished speakers, participants, and guests, welcome to the event Taliban and Digital Life, co-organized by the Islamic Theology of Counterterrorism, ITCT, from United Kingdom, and the Institute for Cyber Policy Studies, Israel. The Taliban is described as an Islamic fundamentalist, militant Islamist, and jihadist political movement, as well as military organization in Afghanistan. From 1994, the Taliban shaped not only the life of Afghanistan, but also affects its neighbors and created implications around the world, including state allies from around the world, as well as opponents, which caused battles and wars for decades. The Taliban was designated as a terrorist group by several states, as well as by the United Nations. The usage of the internet, social networks, and cyberspace by terrorist organizations is well known, with the most prominent example of ISIS and its ability to use the latest modern technology in order to perform physical and traditional terrorist activities, as well as to promote their ideology, the cause, and of course, to terrorize, to create fear. Following the fall of Kabul on 15 August 2021, the Taliban regained control of Afghanistan. Therefore, there is a need to analyze the usage of the digital life by the Taliban, the theme of our event. I'd like to thank our speakers, as Mr. Dahri just mentioned, Dr. Kriti Singh, Assistant Professor, SMFE, Sharda University, India, and Mr. Ahmed Qureshi, a prominent Pakistani journalist and host at PTV, an expert on national security and human rights issues in the Middle East and North Africa region. And of course, my partner for the organization of this event, Mr. Noor Dahri, Executive Director at the Islamic Theology of Counterterrorism, ITCT, United Kingdom. I welcome and greet you at the beginning of our event, Taliban and the Digital Life. Thank you for joining us. May this event be valuable and fruitful to you. I wish you all the good wishes, and especially those days, all the good health. Thank you. And now for our first speaker, Dr. Kriti Singh, Assistant Professor, SMFE, Sharda University, India, for her lecture, Online Indian Press Coverage of Taliban Offensive and Fall of Kabul 2021, a thematic content analysis. Dr. Kriti Singh, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Tal. Good evening, everyone. I'm very grateful to Professor Tal and Dr. Noor Dahri to give me this opportunity to present my paper. I would like to share my screen.
Yeah, you're already your co-host, so you can.
Thank you so much. Is my screen visible?
Yes.
A very good offensive till fall of Kabul 2021, a thematic content analysis. Afghan war is one of the longest running conflict in modern times. The conflict includes multiple actors, internal, external stakeholders, coalition of military forces. In reaction to 11th September attack, the US commenced the airstrikes on Afghanistan. Subsequently, ground offensive under Operation Enduring Freedom began. The aim was to throw Taliban regime and out the Al-Qaeda forces from there. This is a pictorial representation of how US invasion began and later the withdrawal. This is the pictorial representation of April 2021 when the Taliban offensive started, and how gradually May, June, July, you can see how different portions of Afghanistan was captured. The one in orange is Taliban control and one in blue are government control. The aim of paper. Before I start, I want to give a disclaimer. This is a working paper. The aim of the working paper is to analyze the Indian English online press coverage during the recent Afghanistan crisis. The objective is to conduct a thematic content analysis of Indian English online press coverage during the recent Afghanistan crisis. These were the research questions with which the research started. One, what were the common themes identified in the English online coverage coming from India? Second, how was Afghanistan crisis positioned in the Indian English online press coverage? Third, what were the major news sources of Indian English online press coverage? And what were the major places of origin for this? The method used by the research paper is qualitative in nature. It was exploratory. Thematic content analysis were done. Online news articles were identified from identified news websites. The time period of sample was starting from offensive of Taliban on 1st May 2021 to the fall of Kabul on 15th August 2021. Total 106 days, that is around 3 months and 14 days data was collected. The sample was purposive, although I tried to take as many as news reports I could. Inclusion criteria, we used 3 keywords: Afghanistan, Taliban, and Kabul, especially those which were coming from on the headlines. The exclusion criteria were news items which doesn't have those keywords in the headlines, opinion pieces written by news websites, and news in foreign or vernacular language. By using India's English news websites on Google India search engine, which we took on 06 November 2021, following 4 news websites were identified: the Indian Express, the Times of India, Hindustan Times, and New Delhi Television, also known as NDTV. Presently, the analysis for New Delhi Television website have been done. Around 287 news reports were analyzed. I am presently doing the Times of India news reports. Around 75 reports are under analysis, followed by Indian Express and Hindustan Times. For this presentation, I will be presenting the findings which I have got through this research for the New Delhi Television, that is NDTV news reports. Thematic content analysis process, a word on how the process was undertaken. Data was collected, reading and familiarization of data was done, followed by coding. For coding, I used software MaxQDA. I identified the theme, reviewed the theme, defined and named them, and final analysis. As it is one of the news websites which I have identified with the 287 reports, so the final analysis will be only presented for the NDTV news reports. The preliminary findings. The thematic content analysis of New Delhi Television, NDTV news reports. Now I'm going to present before you the graphical representation of how these news reports look like. For the month of May, 12 news reports were there, and this is the word cloud, the most frequently used words in those news reports. Followed by June, around 48 news reports were there. Then July, 116. And this is the combined word cloud. Moving forward, now I'm going to share the major themes which I have identified in my analysis of these news reports. In May, 12 news stories were identified following the inclusion and exclusion criteria. And major themes identified were US withdrawal from Afghanistan, Taliban attacks on civilians and Afghan government assets, ceasefire during Eid, closing of embassies, US President Biden's official statements, US recognizing India as a key part in Afghanistan talks, history of Afghanistan war, September attack, 11th attacks on US were one continuous theme which was reoccurring in the data, especially the data which was coming from US President Biden's speech, and exotosphere. In the month of June, 48 news reports were analyzed, in which again the major themes were predominantly US withdrawal from Afghanistan. Continuous theme which were emerging again and again was the fear of Taliban, Afghanistan government's last-ditch effort to secure international cooperation, India's concern regarding the latest development in Afghanistan, India's insistence on durable peace in Afghanistan, deliberation in UN about crisis unfolding in Afghanistan, Taliban aggressive offensive and capture of towns and financial assets, Afghan forces abandonment, fall of Sher Khan Badar port, Afghan soldiers fleeing to Tajikistan, spread of Taliban, US-made infrastructure used by Taliban, impact of Taliban offensive on financial assets of Afghanistan, fierce battle between the Taliban and Afghan forces in different parts of the country, India's efforts for comprehensive ceasefire, US call for negotiation, Doha talks are again very dominating theme here in Taliban and Afghan government, US evacuation of Afghan interpreters who had worked for US forces, then US security assistance to Afghanistan, US 3 million doses of vaccine aid to Afghanistan. In the month of July, 116 news reports were analyzed. These are the major themes. Again, US withdrawal from Afghanistan, repetition, fear of Taliban, fierce fight between Taliban and Afghan forces in different parts of countries, UN General Austin Myler stepping down as a commander in Afghanistan, a symbolic step, US troops leave Bagram Air Base, American and coalition forces complete withdrawal from the airbase. Taliban aggressive offensive, increased violence-related news, Afghanistan forces killed over 6,000 Taliban terrorists, withdrawal month finalized in August, Afghan government counter-offensive, Afghanistan people left to fend for themselves. That was one repeated quote which was coming during when I was analyzing these 116 news reports. Afghan soldiers fleeing to Tajikistan. Although there were a lot of images which came in while I was analyzing the news reports, because the scope of the paper was to look at the content, not at the visuals or the photographs. So that has not been taken in account. Afghanistan government inability to provide reinforcement to its soldiers. Tajikistan response to conflict being non-interference and good neighbor lines. Afghanistan forces crumbling, loss of morale in Afghan forces, how US bases were being given to Afghan security forces, Iran talks between Afghanistan government delegates meeting with Taliban, assault of capital Kuala Anwar by Taliban, increased Taliban offensive. UK apprehensions on unfolding crisis, Russian response to sharp rise in tension of Afghan-Tajik border, aid stalled at Kabul aircraft, Afghanistan hints at seeking India's military assistance, India discusses situation of Afghanistan at Shanghai Cooperation Organization, UK gives statements to work with Afghanistan Taliban if it comes to power. Taliban captured key border crossing with Pakistan, and a lot of news reports came, especially during the Pulsar winner photograph journalist Danish Siddiqui, killing in Afghanistan crisis and India's response to it. A strategic momentum gained by Taliban. India continues efforts in Afghanistan peace process. US air strikes to repeal Taliban offensive. Violence surging across Afghanistan. Mass human displacement. Taliban support to China. Taliban to support China. Natural disaster in Afghanistan. Coming to the August, around 111 news reports were analyzed. Following are the major themes. Target killing, especially Afghanistan pilots. EU rejection of Taliban as government. Afghan refugees growing crisis. Fighting rage at Afghanistan. US, UK embassies response accused Taliban of war of crime. India's heightened concern on terror camp in Afghanistan. Increased Taliban offensive. Increased violence. Afghanistan calls to seek India's help. Russia invites US, China, and Pakistan for deliberation over the crisis. UNSC discussion on the crisis. Taliban assassinates Afghan government medical department, media department head. Afghan Sikhs under threat. UK nations leaving Afghanistan. Taliban captures important provinces. Taliban targeting media person. Especially there was one report, disturbing report, how a comic was killed by Talibans. Taliban conditioned to talk about only based on Gandhi's removal. Rapid offensive of Taliban and fall of major provinces. Afghanistan heading for failed state, and in the fall of Kabul. Data analysis of news resources from where the NDTV took their news from. This is the graphical representation of approximately 287 newspaper and the sources from which the NDTV was reporting. A major source was coming from AFP, followed by Press Trust of India and Asian News International, Reuters, and NDTV desk. A very few reports were actually coming from NDTV desks. These are the number of news reports from the place of their origin, where the maximum number were coming from Kabul, followed by New Delhi, Washington, and so on. The conclusion. This conclusion is from the Indian perspective with regards to it, and this is a preliminary observation only based on news reports of NDTV, not the others, because it's a working paper. There were very less reports of Taliban offensive in online news media reportage in the beginning of May. I've already shown you only 14 news reports when such a major thing was happening from NDTV news website. Gradually, we see that there was an increased reportage during the June onwards. And not only in terms of text, but also visuals that the news were representing over what was going there in Afghanistan. Approximately 287 news were analyzed, and most of them were wire copies of AFP or Reuters, followed by PTI and ANI, which is from India. Barring a few copies, the online stories were only carrying the Western media agenda, which from the Indian perspective, we had PTI and ANI, which were giving how India is taking this view. But from the NDTV news website, they were op-eds, but not news reports. There were very few news reports which were directly coming from the NDTV desk. However, a further research will bring more light how four major Indian news websites reported in this event will bring the final result. These are my references. Thank you so much for your patient listening. And the floor is yours, Professor Tal.
Thank you very much, Dr. Singh. May I have a few questions now, or Mr. Dahri at the end? I can have a few questions now. I noted for myself, it was a fascinating and enriching presentation. Is it possible?
You can start questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. Is it? May I have some questions, Dr. Singh? Thank you.
Sure, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. You mentioned, first of all, four Indian media outlets that you analyze as part of your very interesting and important research. And I wonder, first of all, is there any sentiment that we can see from those reports? I mean, is there any dominant sentiment when describing the Taliban and the activities in those four media outlets, or whether the reports are general without any positive or negative sentiment, but how do you see it?
Thank you so much. It's a very interesting question. When I was going through these reports, one sentiment which was very dominating is the fear of Taliban, especially when the news reports where the excerpts from the common people were coming, excerpts from the Afghan government soldiers were coming, or police forces excerpts were coming. So one thing which was again and again repeating itself, the fear. Second, the uncertainty. From my perspective as a researcher, when I was doing coding, I said plight. I coded those sentences as plight. The plight was there. The helplessness of the Afghan people were very highly depicted in the news reports that I was reading. And that continuous fear, what will be the next? And the visuals, which although visuals were not the part of this research, but even the visuals which I was seeing, especially coming from the airbase when they are moving out, and the helplessness on the faces of Afghan people, I think that sentiment, if we have to put it in binary, negative and positive, it was negative dominated sentiments.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. I saw that when you created this graphic demonstration of word count, that the dominant word was Afghanistan. And it's interesting, not necessarily Taliban. The dominant word was, as far as I saw that, was Afghanistan. Am I right?
Yes, you are right. The word frequency, which was created by these softwares, showed that were the dominating words, which were again and again being used in the content. One was Taliban.
Okay, another question, please. Once again, there were four, as I understood, four media outlets. Did you see any change between them in the way of coverage or the way that they address Taliban and the activities, or that there is the same pattern, the same mode the same theme that can be found in all the four Indian media outlets.
As I've already told you, it's a working paper, and I've just finished with NDTV news reports, and presently I'm doing Times of India news reports. I've yet to, and I'm presently doing data collection for Indian Express and the Hindustan Times. This answer to this question, I will be able to give once I have gone through all the four news websites which I've identified. However, preliminary observation here, comparing the NDTV and the kind of news which were reported, because I'm seeing it from the Indian perspective. One, I'm seeing that how much the Western media wire stories dominated our narrative in India. And secondly, one thing which I couldn't see when I was searching for these news, that where was the Afghanistan's narrative in it? I will rephrase it. Like when I was going through the news stories, there was news stories from AFP, there was news stories from Reuters, PTI, ANI, but these are the lens of a wire service or the person or the media person who's setting the agenda for that day. I'm very curious to see that how, if there was any news outlet or any news website which Indian news media have taken directly coming from Afghanistan, which I've yet to see. But the right answer to your question will be only possible once I run through the entire four outlets.
Of course, Dr. Singh. And sorry, but it was very, very interesting lecture and research. And I do have, with your permission, another one question. Well, at least one. I have some, but
you may ask as many questions as you want.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. I think it was.
Best of my best.
Thank you. I think it was slide number 34, and which present the numbers of coverages in the Indian media outlet as well as AFP, Agence France Presse. And I saw that AFP had multiple times more reports rather than the local Indian media outlet, and especially when compared to the NDTV. Why it's happened like that? What is the reason?
My understanding is, and this is one thing which I've came in the conclusion also, that India narrative, because I'm seeing the paper from India's narrative, where we have created our narrative when we are, though they were Indian news report like PTR and ANI was giving out Indian narrative, but how from the NDTV desk? Why less? One of the major, my understanding, because for that I have to conduct another research to give you a right answer, but my understanding is during that time, India was undergoing a COVID peak simultaneously. So most of the news coming from that point in time news at least was very much dominating for news related to COVID. And we were undergoing this Delta peak, COVID during April, May, June. That was a very tough time for India as a country. And the other news which were dominating were from our own security region was the face-off between India and China. So that is where I was seeing that the news, especially coming from NDTV desk. There's another thing that I would like to add, because presently I'm also doing another research where I'm trying to understand what was the challenges faced by Indian defense correspondents during COVID-19. And although the research is presently I'm doing, but I can correlate it with your question now. One of the major reasons, because India was, at that point in time facing the wrath of COVID-19, the media structures were under tremendous stress. In terms of the news force, the workforce was working on a skeleton structure. The condition of the journalists themselves who were infected by COVID, and a huge role COVID also played in terms, if I see from the Indian perspective, it posed itself as a very big challenge to the Indian media itself. So within so many things happening, and this important development of Afghanistan is also happening. But from agenda at that point in time was giving to the Indian citizens. So that is to my understanding and one of the reason. Secondly, I've seen PTI and I have covered a lot of India's take over this, this particular news, which is again Indian based. But yes, I can now when I'm correlating these two research, I may say that the COVID pandemic and the stress on the media, Indian news media industry can one of the reasons.
Thank you very much, Dr. Singh, for your detailed answers. I know that Mr. Dahri have a question for you, Dr. Singh.
Sure, please go ahead.
Hello, hi, Dr. Singh. Fantastic. Just give one question. When you are doing research on these Indian newspapers, did you evaluate the sources of whether how much is the bias percentage of news reporting for the Taliban in the Indian newspapers? Did you ever cross-check from the Afghanistan's newspaper as well as the neighbor country Pakistan newspaper or the international newspaper to evaluate how much accurate news you are covering for the Indian newspaper research for the Indian newspaper? Did you have any mechanism? Did you use that things and to evaluate the things? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Zari. Actually, it's a very interesting question that you have asked. And me as a researcher always looks at, different way of seeing a problem. And I may say, I may admit that, every research study have a limitation and a scope. And and after having this point, I think that is something which was beyond the scope of this research, and I will consider it because it was beyond the scope of this research, thus making it a limitation of this research. Nevertheless, in future research, this is a very it's a new perspective that you have bring forward. That biasness also needs to be checked because objectivity is the foundation. It's the pillar of the news, every news as journalism. Nevertheless, although because my scope was only looking at the online news coming the desks of 4 major news portals, but majority what I was seeing, because it was AFP and Reuters. So how will that that, so I can say that it was not just India centric media reports which were being generated, but also the Western centric news reports will be generated. And as I've also mentioned while answering to Professor Tal, that I was also looking forward that news from Afghanistan, whether we are capturing there or not. So I do see there as a gap, and a research gap always calls for another research study. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Singh. Do we have any question from the audience to Dr. Singh? Someone would like to ask a question, you may raise your hand or open your mic.
I think the audience questions we can ask in the end, 5-10 minutes we give it audience.
Okay.
To move forward with the Ahmed question, I think.
So now let's move to our second speaker, Mr. Ahmed Quraishi, a prominent Pakistani journalist and a host at PTV, expert on national security and human rights issues in the Middle East and North Africa region. Mr. Quraishi presentation will be on Taliban 2.0, steps followed by the militia to reshape its international message. Mr. Ahmed Quraishi, the floor is yours and you have co-host privilege.
Right, thank you very much, Dr. Pavel, and it's a privilege to be with you and with Noor Dahri, and also with Dr. Singh and the distinguished participants who are with us in the seminar. And I'd like to also thank your colleagues at the Institute for Cyber Policy Studies for choosing this topic, and also thank my friend Noor Dahri of the Islamic theology. I'm sorry, just a second. Yeah, for the Islamic theology of counterterrorism, for your coordination and help in formulating the theme that I'm going to focus on. And the reason I think we need to focus really on on Taliban 2.0 and how the Taliban reshaped its message for the world is because I believe sitting here in Islamabad and we are here watching very closely, just as the world is doing, just as you are doing, how the Taliban is moving forward. I believe that the Taliban are shaping a new model in how an Islamist group shapes its message for the world. And it is my claim that this is a very different message, and it needs to be studied in order to understand where it's going. And one reason for that is that for a long time, the ruling clerics in Iran, whom I like to refer to as the Khomeinists to distinguish them from other Islamist groups in the region, the Khomeinists were the most successful Islamists in the Middle East in seizing and clinging to power. And now they face challenge to this coveted position from the Taliban. And this is significant. Why? Let me just quickly elaborate on this. The Islamists in Morocco, in Algeria, were non-starters. The Islamists in Egypt were too eager and fell apart. The Islamists in the Gulf couldn't challenge the social order in the Gulf and also in Jordan. In Syria and Iraq, they were brutally suppressed and faced resistance from a strong civil society in Turkey and also in Pakistan. But Iran is the only example where Islamists seized power and sustained their rule for 4 decades. The Iranian Islamists, the Khomeinis, were successful in transitioning into a state, and they remained and continued to be in power 4 decades later. Now, the Taliban are attempting to repeat this, to do this, to cling to power and to stay in power and create conditions to stay in power. The Taliban are doing it probably, and this is what I'm seeing, my observation. The Taliban are doing it probably faster and so far more successfully than the Khomeinists in next door Iran, or for example, compared to Hezbollah, Hamas, Muslim Brotherhood, Houthis, other Islamist groups in terms of how those groups managed to shape their message for the world. And this is why looking at how the Taliban are doing it is interesting. So I'm just going to give you 5 observations, very studied observations that I have collected both in my direct interactions with a couple of Taliban officials and indirect interactions with people who have directly dealt with people who are officials of various governments in various positions who have dealt directly with the Taliban. So 5 what I feel are very interesting observations and facts. First, the Taliban largely did not resort to physically eliminating their ideological and political enemies in seizing power this time. And I say largely, they largely did not resort to physically eliminating their ideological and political enemies, largely because there are individual reports of harassment and elimination, such as the one referred to by Dr. Singh, for example, the comedian, the Afghan comedian who was brutally killed by Taliban elements in Kandahar in the initial days of their takeover in Kabul, and some other incidents as well. But nothing on a grand scale so far. So far, nothing on a grand scale. So the first attempt or the first message by the Taliban for the world, and this was a reshaped message, completely different from what the Taliban did when it first came to power 25 years ago in 1996. This time it did not resort to physically eliminating their ideological and political enemies on a larger scale. So this is interesting. For example, former President Karzai, former Vice President Dr. Abdullah continue to operate in Kabul and meet local and foreign visitors. And again, there are reports of restrictions and I've spoken to some people who are close to or have been close to for former President Karzai and former Vice President Dr. Abdullah. And I heard about some restrictions, but generally they've been allowed to meet domestic Afghan and international foreign visitors and issue statements and do interviews and so forth with the international media. So this somewhat newfound tolerance for opponents is significant because Islamists generally prefer zero-sum situations. There's little tolerance really for their opponents. So here the Taliban are trying to reshape their message. So that's one observation. Second method the Taliban used this time around to reshape their messages is let me just put it this way in this observation. No other Islamist group in the Middle East received the opportunities that the Taliban received for international engagement. Again, the Khomeinists in Iran are the only exception, but they did it over several decades. The Taliban's space for international engagement with other governments is so far bigger and have been created this space in a very short time. I would say just 2 years. So let me just give you very quick examples. Direct meetings with American, Russian, and Chinese officials in Doha, Qatar. Meetings in Moscow, in Beijing, almost in every capital from Ankara to Dushanbe. Direct meetings with the current director of the Central Intelligence Agency in Kabul, of all places. Direct one-to-one, and this is very important, direct one-to-one public meeting with the foreign minister of Indonesia, Ms. Retno Marsudi. Of course, Indonesia is the largest Muslim majority nation in the world and also the largest country by population size within the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC. So very significant meeting between the Taliban foreign minister of the interim government and the foreign minister of Indonesia. And another example, the Afghan Taliban got to participate in a summit meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Dushanbe. And lastly, participate in the extraordinary session of the Council of Foreign Ministers of the OIC, the world's second largest multilateral organization. And this is important, with the presence of the big powers, the US, UK, France, Russia, China, and also the EU and the GCC. So no other Islamist group really got this many opportunities for international engagement to reshape its message the way the Taliban did over the last 1.5 years or 2 years. Third observation is the Taliban in 2 years developed an and this is very important again, the Taliban in 2 years developed an organized team of people suitable for international engagement. So now the Taliban, they have a group of people who are well spoken in English. Some of them even speak with a hint of British accent or American accent. They're very good in their English communication with the international media. I would say the Taliban have done it in a shorter time as compared to, for example, the Khomeinists in Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah, Muslim Brotherhood. All of these groups took years and years, I would say even decades, to develop. For example, Hezbollah took many, many decades actually to develop their political office that deals now with the international media. And so does the Hamas, for example. The Houthis have done it in a shorter time, but again, it took them, they're not really that good. The Khomeinians did it in Iran, but again, it took them more than a decade or two before they were finally able to communicate with the world properly. The Taliban have done it in a couple of years. I'm sure many of you have seen probably the interview with one of the Taliban spokespersons, I would say a very presentable young man who looks like the Taliban, dressed in the Taliban attire, but with a very smiling face and a very, very good English language presentation skills. I met one of them. I met one of them who goes by the name of Abdul Kahar Balkhi, who is a official translator for the foreign minister of the Taliban interim government, and a very likable young man. So the Taliban, in 2 years, developed this small team of people who are very good in dealing with the international media. So this was the third observation. The fourth is the Taliban took visible steps to distance themselves from religious extremism. Now, when I say this, I will be very careful. I say this knowing that not many outside Afghanistan really buy this. And certainly many inside Afghanistan and outside Afghanistan are awaiting for tangible steps from the Taliban to measure this change. But the Taliban did take steps to at least show that they want to distance themselves from religious extremism. Not very convincingly so far, I must say. But I would say I have a couple of very strong examples that I would like to share. One that I witnessed myself here in Islamabad when the Taliban interim government foreign minister visited here, and during a media interaction at a think tank, Foreign Minister, Taliban interim Foreign Minister Muttaqi, took a question from a Pakistani journalist. The question was, I would say, could have been a trap, really. The question was basically asking the Afghan foreign minister to sort of express his joy at defeating the United States and defeating the West, and get into that jubilant language. And I expected probably, and many of the journalists frankly expected the Taliban foreign minister maybe to fall in this trap. He didn't. In fact, he completely deflected the question. He refused to get into the celebratory, jubilant, anti-Western hint in the question that the questioner tried to present. The response was very meek, very neutral by the Afghan foreign minister, and certainly completely avoided anti-Western language. So it showed for many of us who were present that the Taliban foreign minister is actually trying not to get into an anti-Western mode or or criticize the US. Very interesting. I also remember another instance in Kabul, one of the earliest press briefings by the Afghan foreign minister, where he very smilingly actually reached out to the US and said, and I'm not quoting exactly, but in as many words, said something to the effect of, America is a big country. We would like to see America show its big heart. And of course, he was referring to unfreezing the assets of the Afghan central bank in American banks. So a third instance I remember, very interesting, at one interaction again here when he was visiting Islamabad, during a conversation with one of the journalists, he said publicly on record, he said, the US government is asking us to invite Afghan opposition leaders into government and expand and make it a representative government, and smilingly says, but we never asked Mr. Biden why he did not let or give a seat in the American cabinet to Mr. Trump. And he said it in a very light way. So it just seemed to us, to many of us, that the Taliban is trying to shape a message toward the West that is not the traditional anti-Western message. So that was my fourth observation. And my last observation is the fifth. Taliban is giving now signals that it has an ongoing internal debate and struggle within the Taliban, inside the Taliban, over issues like political freedoms, engaging the opposition, and women's rights. Now, this could be a deliberate attempt, obviously, by the Taliban to buy time, to show the world that they're changing. It could be staged, managed. It's quite possible, obviously. There's no way for me as a journalist to ascertain and say that is the case. But again, we also have indications that, and we've seen that not only in conversations with some of the Taliban officials, but also in conversations with some of the officials of other third governments who interacted with Taliban officials. And they've been saying, some of them privately, obviously, that the Taliban officials have been at pain to sort of convince them that, you know, we have a situation within the Taliban itself.
Mr. Quraishi?
And I remember that I've spoken to somebody here in Islamabad who was privy to the meeting between the Taliban foreign minister and the foreign minister of Indonesia, the woman foreign minister of Indonesia, who is actually very critical of the Taliban, the foreign minister of Indonesia, and has on a couple of occasions openly called on the Taliban to respect the rights of women, and including the rights, those rights that are granted by Islam, but which the Taliban is suppressing, including the right to education. So these are 5 observations that very quickly, and this is a huge topic, obviously, to give you from the perspective of a journalist, the 5 key areas in the Taliban trying to change and reshape their message to the world. And I conclude in conclusion, the Taliban face great opportunity, but also they face great peril at the same time. And for me, as a student of Middle East politics, I'm waiting to see if the Taliban succeed in beating the record of other Islamist movements in the region in terms of longevity in power, and if they beat the record of the Khomeinists in Iran, who so far were the most successful Islamists really in the region in terms of staying in power. But let's see if the Taliban can actually beat that record in terms of transitioning into a state and in terms of embracing a culture of tolerance and diversity and governance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ahmad Quraishi, for this very, very important description and lecture of yours of the Taliban and its activities and how it's perceived in the world. Mr. Dahri, you have some questions.
Yes, Mr. Ayman. Thank you, Tal. It was fantastic, your opinion, and world needs to definitely listen this point of view as well. I have a questions. As you mentioned, I personally on social media, I've seen some Taliban's youngsters with a brilliant English accent of Americans and British, and how they present the Taliban's reshaping of their message and political background. It's completely fantastic. However, the world powers, they are not interested in their words. They're interested in actions, because this is why the big disaster is awaiting, unfortunately, for the Afghan public, for the people, because of the aid. 85% aid was coming from the Western government, as you are much aware of than us, and it has been completely suspended, right? Because they want to see the actions, and they're the one of the actions was in a Qatar agreement that they have to bring all coalition governments, including politically. Before they were the political opponents, they wanted to bring from every corner of Afghanistan, which they failed. They didn't do that so far. Yes, they have showed some of the Tajiks, but they all are Talibans. The government, the intelligence power, they are interested in old foes to become a friends and a new coalition government, which you understand, not the Taliban from Tajik or Taliban from Hazara or Taliban from the other regions, right? Second thing is schools of girls. Still there is a reservation. Most of the human rights organizations, they are blaming Taliban that they are still good in words, but we didn't see the actions happening in action happening on the ground. So these are the reservation how Taliban can, because as time is running out of the because of the winter, is the disaster is waiting in the Afghan people, and there's no jobs. Even I've seen the Afghan. I have a contact with Afghan and even Afghan foreign office in Ashraf Ghanis, and they are working in daytime. They are working in office for without any wage, and the evening they are selling the vegetables in the markets. Right, this is a situation is coming in Afghanistan. Second question is that you have attended is Arab what was a meeting happened in Islamabad, Arabs foreign ministers.
The OIC.
OIC, thank you very much. Afghanistan and the world, and we especially Pakistan, was waiting for they announce some kind of aid to the Afghan, to the Afghan, for the people, but they didn't announce anything because they were still looking for the which way we can deliver the aid because of the sanctions through the internet from the international community. And there was another event was happening exactly same day in India, which all the these neighboring countries, they were engaging themselves in India. Plus Taliban has also said that they have no any problem with India to make relations as long as they are helping us in aid. So tomorrow they will ask definitely from Iran, if the Iran can help them, they will go in the Iran bloc, because they need the aid and they need aid. So these are a couple of questions. How would you define these ones, please? Thank you very much.
Yes. Yes, Noor, I fully agree with your characterization, the way you put it. I fully agree with that. I endorse it. Of course, I hope you also understand that I was playing the role of the devil's advocate. So I was presenting the perspective of the Taliban and how they shaped their message for the world. And obviously, there's no question that they face a question of credibility. The world is awaiting action, and none of the countries that I know of that attended the OIC Council of Foreign Ministers meeting here in December was satisfied so far with the Taliban's presentation of facts. It's all very nice and funny to hear the Foreign Minister Muttaqi, the Foreign Minister of the interim government of the Taliban in Kabul, smile and say, well, you know, we never asked President Biden why no seat for President Trump in his cabinet. So why ask us to have our opponents in our government to make it representative? It's all nice to hear that, but it's good for table talk, but it's not what the world is waiting from the Taliban. The world is waiting for action, as you said, and that's exactly what happened in the OIC meeting. Almost all of the Muslim countries, not a single country of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation member states, 57 countries, was ready to recognize the interim Taliban government. The Taliban delegation was hoping that maybe there will be some movement forward on the recognition by at least a couple of Muslim governments. None agreed. None of the Muslim governments agreed, not Pakistan, not Saudi Arabia, not Turkey, not Indonesia, no one else. That's number one. And number two, not only that, but let me just give you this very interesting thought. It's not only the international human rights organizations or the West that is asking the Taliban to respect, for example, women's rights or have a representative government, but also the Muslim government. So for example, the foreign minister of Turkey in the opening session of the OIC actually directly asked the Taliban to give women the rights that the women deserve. So did the foreign minister of Indonesia, very openly and publicly. None of the Muslim countries are saying this openly, but privately, if you meet officials from the major Muslim countries, all of them are very cautious with regards to the idea of an Islamist organization a violent one which bears arms, seizing power in a Muslim country. No Muslim country wants this example to succeed. We've seen it happen in Yemen. We've seen the Houthis take over power. We've seen the Iran-backed militias in Iraq partially seize power in Iraq and become part of the power structure. We've seen what Hezbollah has done in Lebanon, and partially we've seen what Hamas has done in Gaza Strip. Muslim countries are wary of militant groups transitioning into new governments, and nobody wants this example to become the norm. So Muslim countries are divided, all the neighboring countries, including Pakistan. On the one hand, they don't want to see a huge disaster in Afghanistan. Nobody wants to send their troops to secure the peace inside Afghanistan. But at the same time, they need somebody who's bearing arms, who's standing on the streets of Kabul, for example, to secure the country. And it just seems there's no one to do it on the ground who has the capacity to do it except the Taliban for now. But that's not enough to recognize the Taliban, as you rightly said. They need to move on, or there will be a tragedy, things will get out of control of the Taliban, and the international community will then look for alternatives. And alternatives will be costly, there's no question about it, but they do exist. So it's not as if the Taliban is the last option, but so far it is the de facto option that the world is willing to deal with, at least in terms of providing aid to the Afghan people. And I conclude very quickly by something very important you referred to, which is the world was waiting for donations for the Afghanistan in that meeting. I would slightly not agree with this, because this was not a donor meeting. No country was supposed to actually announce any donations for Afghanistan. Why? Because that's a very latter stage. The initial problem for which everybody met, actually, the OIC came together with the big powers and everybody was there. They were there for only one point and one agenda only, and that is how to help the Afghan people without actually helping the Taliban. The world wants to help the Afghan people and wants to give them aid, but without handing over that aid to the Taliban. So that was the question, and that is what is being resolved right now.
Thank you, Mr. Quraishi. Mr. Noor, do you have some more questions?
No, that's fine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Noor. I have some, well, I wrote down, I don't know, something like at least 3, 4, but I know that we are behind schedule, and there is some questions from the audience, so I'll be very, very short. You know, we speak about the theme of this event is the Taliban and the digital life. What can you say about the digital life and the digital activities of the Taliban? And I wrote down a phrase that you said, reshape its messages. You mentioned reshape its message. What can you tell about the digital activities of the Taliban nowadays?
Yeah, well, Dr. Pavel, I would say the Taliban remain to be very primitive when it comes to the social media. So I have not seen, I would say probably this is the least sophisticated Islamist group in terms of using the social media. So for example, Hamas and Hezbollah and the Khomeinists and Houthis, everybody, there's Al-Qaeda, definitely. They're all very sophisticated in their use of the social media. You don't see the Taliban really doing that. I don't see them really. They are now on Twitter, especially ever since they began the Doha process, the peace talks, especially some of their spokespersons. But if you follow their tweets, and I'm doing that as well, I see them very ordinary, very normal. I don't see out of the way being very creative in how they use Twitter, for example, or Facebook for the matter, or YouTube. I don't see them doing that at all. So I would very easily say that the Taliban so far have not shown that they've invested a lot in social media. Not a lot, not as compared to, for example, the Taliban. We have a group called the Pakistani Taliban inside Pakistan, which is far more sophisticated in their use of social media than the Afghan Taliban, for example. And obviously, I already said Hamas and Hezbollah and everybody else, they are way ahead of the Afghan Taliban. So the Taliban are not as active, really. I think they're solely dependent for reshaping their message on direct communication with the international media. That's the only area where the Taliban seems to be really focused, in addition to the bilateral interactions with officials of other governments. So they're only using bilateral interactions with other diplomats of other governments, number one. And number two, they're using the international media interviews with Al Jazeera, and you'll be surprised that even now, you have the BBC, the CNN, including their female correspondents working in Kabul, often standing right next to Taliban soldiers on the streets and beaming their reports live or recording their reports via video. So the Taliban are using the media and using bilateral interactions, not so much the social media.
It's very amazing what you just said, because as you mentioned, Hamas, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, and especially Islamic State, which was, master in using modern technology to perform physical, traditional terrorist activities and to disseminate the call, the message, the ideology, the fear. And especially, perhaps that's the reason, I don't know, I'm interested to know what you think about it, that Hamas and Hezbollah, they are not running states. Of course, both of them, Islamic States as well as Qaeda and Taliban as well, they are designated as terrorist groups, terrorist organizations. But the Taliban, they are running the states.
But they don't have. Yeah, but they don't have social media. It was very strange. And the Hamas social media, Dr. Pavel, is very sophisticated. Hezbollah, Houthis are, I would say, decades ahead of the Taliban. The Taliban simply do not have a social media structure. I don't think they even have any accounts on YouTube, for example, or Instagram. Whereas Hezbollah and Hamas are using all of these platforms. And obviously ISIS, I think, is the most advanced of all of them, along with the Al-Qaeda and the Khomeinists. I would say the Khomeinists, Hezbollah, and Houthis are the most impressive, along with the ISIS as well, obviously. Then I would say Hamas, and then at the very last, I would put the Taliban. The Taliban actually are not even in that category, not even in that group. They're so primitive. And maybe that's because they've been directly involved in battlefields and had no time really to set up offices for social media. They don't have cells operating in the West, for example, the way Hamas sympathizers and Hezbollah sympathizers and the Khomeini sympathizers do, exploiting humanitarian asylum loopholes in Western laws. And you see Hezbollah, Khomeiniist, Hamas sympathizer cells operating in multiple Western countries, unfortunately. But the Taliban do not have that. The Taliban do not have any sympathetic media or social media cells that are based, for example, in London or in Paris or any other country, and projecting Taliban's viewpoint to the world. So it's only those Taliban officials who are either in Kabul or in Doha, Qatar, who are operating a few, I think 24 or so Twitter handles, and that's it. That's it.
Two short remarks. One, you mentioned Hamas, and Of course, Hamas actives on Twitter and so on, but they have also activities on Telegram. You know, they have active Telegram accounts in Arabic,
Yes.
English, and in Hebrew as well. It's amazing, but Hamas have also active Telegram account on Hebrew. That's the first thing. The second is that I think perhaps the reason for the difference in online and internet and perhaps even cyber activity, pardon, activities between ISIS and Taliban, is the reason that ISIS, had lots of foreign recruiters from the West that knew TikTok, knew applications, and knew how to create, you know, plugins of the Amac news agency to Firefox browser and applications, mobile applications. So perhaps, I don't know, it's just an assumption that perhaps the reason is that ISIS had a lot of recruiters from the West, and that they had knowledge and background, this Western digital technological culture, perhaps.
Yeah, and I was just thinking, Dr. Pavel, that somehow the Taliban are the only Islamist group that does not have organized sympathizers based in the West, like Hezbollah, Hamas, ISIS, and Khomeinians do. So you have all these four Islamist groups with organized following based in the West. You don't have that for the Taliban, and you don't see the Taliban very keen on organizing any sympathetic organized. There might be many unorganized sympathizers of the Taliban in the West, but none that are organized. And you don't see the Taliban officials really wanting to change that or to have organized. They're not really very interested in having, for example, offices or sympathetic groups supporting them based outside of Afghanistan. So far. So this is very interesting. That's why I'm again repeating, studying the Taliban model so far that they're presenting is very important, because they are bringing change to the script, to the playbook of Islamist groups that we've seen so far. They do not. I'm sure if we had a Taliban official right now sitting in this webinar right now, I would assume that they would object actually in clubbing or repeatedly mentioning their name, Taliban, along with Hezbollah and Hamas and Khomeinists and Houthis and so forth, because they want to really be seen differently. They want to separate themselves from that lot. Will they succeed? I don't know. We have to wait and see. They have an internal struggle. Who will succeed? They have some moderates. But they have a huge a number of people who are actually very, I would say, hardline. And there was a question here. There was an observation actually by somebody here in the webinar, and I was just reading some of the comments when Mr. Naeem mentioned that the Taliban are basically very conservative, so they don't probably even use the social media. They don't want to be on YouTube, on Twitter, except for the people who have to be now because they're the spokespersons, like the foreign minister and so forth. But the rest of them, they're not on social media. So they're even actually more hardline than Hamas and Hezbollah and ISIS and Khomeinists and Houthis. They are so hardline, they want nothing to do with the social media. And I don't know if they can, how can they survive in a world that is so dependent on social media, really, for shaping perceptions?
Thank you, Mr. Qureshi, for your answer, detailed answer. We have from my end one question from the audience. I know that Mr. Dahri have some others. There is a question of Ms. Catherine Baudot-Osterman from France, who asks, distancing from extremism, is it through the same way from Al-Qaeda and ISIS? Once again, distancing from extremism, is it through the same way from Al-Qaeda and ISIS?
Okay, I think I read that somewhere. So basically, Dr. Pavel, what she's asking is if the Taliban are trying to distance themselves from the type of extremism that ISIS and Al-Qaeda purvey. Is that your understanding of the question?
That's what I understand. Yeah, that's what I understand.
Yes, Catherine. Yes, Catherine. Thank you. I can see you now. Thank you, Catherine. Yes, that's exactly my understanding as well, that the Taliban officials who are in power, or the ones that we, the media, see, or the officials of third countries meet, those officials privately say that they do not want to be clubbed together with the kind of extremism that ISIS and Al-Qaeda have been promoting for so many years. And yes, that is my understanding as well. And when we counter them and say, well, if you want to differentiate yourselves from ISIS and Al-Qaeda, how come you're not doing what needs to be done when it comes to, for example, girl education and women rights? And their answer here, I think, is what sort of differentiates them from ISIS and Al-Qaeda. They basically say, well, you can see us in Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan right now. Every week there are a number of protests by Afghan women, and often they scream and shout to the face of Taliban soldiers who are deployed on Afghan streets. And we try to contain them, but we do not try to silence them. So from the point of view of the Taliban, they think that by doing this, the Taliban, are giving an impression or a message to the world that they're not ISIS, they're not Al-Qaeda, but they are conservative, they're hardline, they still have problems and issues with girl education, with the women working and so forth, and they're trying to deal with that. They want time, and they keep saying, we want time, give us time. But they say that whatever we're doing, whatever our deficiencies or weaknesses, we are different from Al-Qaeda, and we're different from ISIS. How much the world would buy that remains to be seen. Nobody's buying it so far. But that's the message, yes. The answer to the question is yes. They want to be seen differently from Al-Qaeda and ISIS.
Thank you, Mr. Quraishi. Mr. Dahri, you have some questions from the audience.
Yes, Tal. Thank you very much. I have a question from Farhan Jeffrey. He sent a question: what do you think about the Taliban and Daesh fight each other? How that can impact on Pakistan? How would you compare Daesh Caliphate and Taliban's Emirates?
Yes, I think this is the only scenario where you could have a resumption of the civil war in Afghanistan. Otherwise, so far, Afghanistan is beyond a civil war now. Nobody wants to fight. Even the old enemies, the Taliban, the Northern Alliance members who were in power for the past 2 decades, none of them, not the Taliban, not those who were in power over the last 2 decades, want a resumption of war. And we've seen a limited conflict immediately after the Taliban takeover in mid-August, but that did not go for very long. It was settled. So the only scenario where you could see a resumption of civil war is the ISIS and Taliban scenario. But so far, it seems to be under control. So far, it doesn't seem to be a major threat. The ISIS do not seem to have the kind, they are there, they exist. Let's not forget, you have elements at the very lower levels of the Taliban who are very, very hardline, And if they see the Taliban leadership at the top becoming moderate, meeting with, for example, the CIA chief director who visits Kabul, meeting with the world and becoming sort of normal, and not a militant Islamist jihadi group that the more hardline elements that the Taliban want them to be, these hardline elements could move and shift toward the ISIS. And that's where you could have trouble. And that's what the Taliban, that's the theory that the Taliban are using now also in their interactions with the international community, with other countries. Help us so that we stop ISIS. Otherwise, if we go, you will have to deal with ISIS and all of the neighboring countries. So the threat is there. If right now Taliban collapses under the weight of mismanagement, bad governance, no aid from the international community, if they collapse right now, yes, there's a real threat of the ISIS emirate of some sort emerging and to fill in the void. And 100% Pakistan would be affected by this, and other neighboring countries would be as well. So it is, but as we speak right now, when we are sitting here, ISIS does not look like the kind of threat as it was in Iraq and Syria, for example.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ahmed. I have a question. I think you can take a last question. I think it's been from Zara, and she said Taliban's are. It's a long message, but I'll just make it short. The Taliban's are still prove them as extremist organization because they still are. There are evidence from the on the ground level by the international media as well as the local media that the Taliban's have started massacring people of their or massacring their rebels from the mosque or from the houses. They kidnap the people, and they have still they are torturing and killing the minorities. But they are very good in outspoken in the front of the media, but on the behind they are completely different. Like in the international media press conference, Taliban's spokesperson, when it was highlighted that Taliban have killed some people, and they say, yeah, they have I received the event, we received the news, but that's not generally of the Taliban's motive, and we will definitely take action against those Talibans. We have already seen the Taliban, some of the Taliban in some areas that hang the people in the crane. Right, when it was pointed out to the spokesperson Taliban, he said, yes, we heard this is not our motive, and we will definitely punish them. What kind of punish? If the people are hanged in the crane like they will used to do in 1995 after that. So it means the people want the same punishment for the Taliban massacres, to kill them and hang them on the crane and show the message to the world, look, this is not our motive. If they kill the people and hanged in the crane, we have punished them as a death penalty. So how they still are think, oh, we arrested them, and we will deal with them according to the law, or we will punish them. But no one's seen that punish. But people are still seeing some areas Taliban have continually started the killings innocent people.
Yes, that's such a great observation, Noor. And I recall the thing that Dr. Singh also referred to, the Afghan comedian in Kandahar who was killed by the Taliban, and there was a video of that. They pulled him out of his house and they took him somewhere and executed him. And no one has been punished so far. And the Taliban actually in Kabul issued a statement saying, we saw that, we don't approve of this, we are investigating and we will take action. We haven't seen that action so far. So this is a very legitimate concern. There's no question about it. I would add this to something that Catherine asked again with regards to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And I would club all of this together, and I would just say, we have to understand one thing. The Taliban right now are facing an internal struggle from within. I will not be surprised over the next few weeks if there were dissent inside the Taliban, and hardline elements disapprove of not being very harsh with regards to women protesting in Kabul, Afghan women, or foreign journalists, women, female journalists working on the streets of Kabul, and so forth. And this is a real serious problem within the Taliban. I will not be surprised to see elements of the Taliban joining Al-Qaeda against the Taliban leadership, which is meeting with the Americans, with the British, with the Russians and the Chinese, because basically the Taliban are very conservative, very hardline, don't want to use the social media, don't even want to do the things that even Hamas and Hezbollah and others do. And they're so conservative. How would the Taliban leadership take them along and take the world along as well at the same time? Not possible. So there's an impending conflict within Taliban awaiting. It hasn't come to the fore yet, but we need to watch for it. It's something very interesting. It's something that we should look at.
Thank you very much. Hamad, I have a question from Shamrez Noman. He asked, can the experts please also discuss a bit more of the ISKP insurgency against Taliban regime, especially in terms of their media messages and propaganda? I think you have explained this already, that ISIS is a very professional in the media, how they use the campaign since they started from the East Syria, but the Taliban haven't learned the lesson how to portray the media image to the world and to the community to see if they are doing any positive things. Definitely they are reshaping. Of course, they are doing some positive things, but no one knows it. No one's seen it.
The Taliban don't want to be on TV because they think it's immoral. They don't want to use the cell phone because they think it's immoral. Instagram, excuse me, they don't want to be on Instagram. Imagine Taliban being on Instagram. So they think, it's beyond them. It's immoral. They're more hardline in their thinking, the Taliban, than, as I said, Hamas or Hezbollah or the Khomeinians or Houthis or ISIS or Al-Qaeda. Taliban they think they're more pure. But at this challenge, there's no question about it. How they will do it, I don't know. But let me just tell you, Noor and everybody, the few people in the Taliban leadership that I've seen, the younger ones who have conducted over the last 2 years this international diplomacy with world powers, let me tell you one thing, you will be shocked how sophisticated this Taliban lot is. It's almost is, I met this young Taliban spokesperson from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Taliban, who, honestly had, if he would shave his beard and remove the turban, I'd say, he could be anyone plying the roads or driving around, I don't know, anywhere in the world.
Normal Afghan person.
Exactly, not a Taliban, not a Taliban. I could imagine that Taliban, his way of speech, the way he talked, the way he conveyed and articulated his ideas. And that's not one person. There's so many. If you go right now to Kabul and meet with the people who are running the administration, and all of them are young Taliban, very cultured, very sophisticated, capable of dealing with the world. How would they coexist with the more hardline elements of the Taliban who are in other cities, who are very pure, who are very conservative and hardline? How would these two work along each other over the long term? Let's see how they do it. It's a huge challenge. I'm so excited to watch how they will do it. But I'm already very impressed, let me tell you, very impressed by this lot of the Taliban who are managing it so far, because they meet with the CIA director in Kabul, and then they have these people who think the mobile phone is immoral. And nobody comes out and says, you meet the director of the CIA
and the MI6 and the
MI6, exactly, and the MI6 as well. You have betrayed our cause. How dare you meet the infidels, how dare you meet these people? And nothing of that sort happened. So there's something going on within the Taliban we need to watch. Noor, there's a question I was just looking at from a PhD student of the JNU University in New Delhi. I think Miss Malhotra, I think her name.
Yeah, you can carry on. Yeah.
And she asked a question with a reference: is it really possible to distinguish between the Taliban and innocent Afghan people when it comes to delivering aid? That's one question. And can the ethical argument of taking aid to the right people be implemented on the ground? So that's very interesting. I mean, can we give aid and pretend that it will not go to the Taliban? That's what she's asking, a very good question. You know, that is exactly the question that 57 member states of the OIC and the big powers, the P5 of the UN Security Council, met last month in December 19, and deliberated upon how to give aid without helping the Taliban. How can we be sure that the aid we're giving actually will not in some convoluted way reach the Taliban hands and enrich them and allow them to sustain their illegal government, which is not representative? So that's a huge question. There's no question about it. But also the people, the world wants to help the Afghan people. What I understand is there are people right now sitting in Jeddah, which is the headquarters of the OIC, and in New York, the headquarters of the UN, who are coordinating or trying to put a mechanism to do that and ensure with guarantees that that the aid will not in some ways reach the Taliban government hands. Will they succeed? Let's see. Let's see. We have to wait and see.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. Robin, he said, how do we see Taliban relations with Pakistan, as there are borders skirmish since 3 weeks and many Taliban leadership coming on media and maligning Pakistan army?
Yes, a huge shocker, really. For
the border conflict was happened recently. Do you know that?
Yes, the skirmishes.
Fans or this, yeah.
Yes, the skirmishes. This is a shocker, obviously, for a lot of us in Pakistan, because initially there was euphoria in Pakistan that somehow a Taliban takeover in Kabul means that we have a friendly government in Kabul who would, you know, have a good relationship with Pakistan. And all of a sudden, we have these stories about and videos and all over social media about skirmishes, which completely changes the narrative of friendly relations. A lot of the people don't know that the Taliban, when they came to power the first time between 1996 and 2001, even at that time, they had border issues with Pakistan and some minor skirmishes. They are bigger, the skirmishes, this time, from what I have seen on social media. If the videos are correct, the size of these skirmishes this time is much bigger than what we saw between 1996 and 2001. So the Taliban are being true to themselves. They haven't changed on that ground. They're still very nationalistic when it comes to whatever they see the problem is on the border. So yes, it's a problematic area in the Pakistan-Taliban relationship. And frankly, there are many Pakistanis who are very excited with the Taliban and sympathetic, but there are also many Pakistanis who understand that having the Taliban in Kabul might be okay in some way, good, you know, because of friendly communications and so forth. But on the long run, it's not good for us, because how can you stop the impact of Taliban sitting in Kabul, emboldening Pakistani extremist groups, which you cannot stop? Already we have groups which have become very emboldened seeing the Taliban. Again, this is the problem of all the 57 member countries of the OIC. All of them are actually disturbed by the fact that having Taliban sitting in Kabul emboldens extremists in their own countries. They don't want that to continue. They don't want to establish a model where a militant group can take over government and everybody recognize it. They don't want. None of the OIC member countries. But at the same time, nobody wants the Afghan headache. Nobody wants to be told by the world if there is, God forbid, a civil war in Afghanistan. Nobody wants, none of the OIC 57 Muslim countries want to hear the lecture from the world. What are you doing? Why don't you send troops? Why don't you secure that country? ISIS is developing there. There's an emirate. Do something. So everybody is in this catch-22 situation where there's no one really to take care of Afghanistan except the Taliban, so for the time being. But at the same time, nobody wants to deal with the Taliban. You know, it's really a very difficult situation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ahmed.
Thank you,
very much.
Mr. Ahmed Qureshi. Now the floor to you, Mr. Noor Dahri, for conclusions and summary and your reflections from this event.
Thank you very much, Tal. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for participating in this event. And no doubt, Afghanistan is a key hub of regional stability around the world. Safe, peaceful, and bright Afghanistan is a prime safety, not only for Pakistan, India, but also former Russian states, as well as around the world. Extremism, terrorism, and drug cartels have rapidly increased in the last 2 decades, and it's not easy to control and eradicate them from Afghan soul. The world should realize that peace cannot be maintained without direct collaboration with the people of Afghanistan, because they are the real victims of religious regional politics, as well as domestic and cross-border terrorism, which have devastated not only the lives, but also the economy of the country. We are hoping that one day the people of Afghanistan would be free from all chaos that faced, and will decide their future without interference of foreign powers. Thank you very much, Mr. Dr. Kirti and Mr. Ahmed Qureshi, for your insightful opinion about the current situation in Afghanistan. And I hope the audience have definitely not only enjoyed the event, but increased their knowledge about key reasons behind the life, politics, and successful cope of the Taliban, unfortunately. Mr. Tal.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dahri, for your conclusions. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank all of you for your participants, for your very interesting and important questions. I'd like to thank our first speaker, Dr. Kriti Singh, Assistant Professor, SMFE, Sharda University, India. And our second speaker, Mr. Ahmed Qureshi, prominent Pakistani journalist and a host at PTV, expert on national security and human rights issues in the Middle East and North Africa region. And of course, my partner and co-organizer, Mr. Noor Dahri, the Executive Director of the Islamic Theology of Counterterrorism, ITCT from United Kingdom. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It was our pleasure and honor to have you here. And definitely it was a very successful one, since we are already more than a half an hour behind schedule, and a lot of interesting and important questions. Thank you very much. Take care and see you in our next event. Thank you.
Thank you.